appreciated. And before we start, let me just introduce the president of PDI, Michael McGrath, who has a few words. Michael?
Right, thanks, Jay. As president of PDI, it's our pleasure to put online these conferences featuring a great presenter like Dominique Hawkins. And we're glad that each of you have joined us today. And as you can see on your screen, we would urge you to donate or join Preservation Delaware, not only to help us continue our work to protect the historic and archaeological resources of Delaware, but as Jay mentioned, keep our future conferences, which I'll mention a couple in a minute, free and open to the public. We need your support for that reason, but also to add to our numbers as we begin a program over the next 12 months of influencing public policy here in Delaware to protect our historic and archaeological resources and to follow up on these excellent presentations regarding flood planning, preparedness for historic buildings. So today, check that out on preservationdE.org. I also want to mention a couple of things that are coming up. I want to mention, first of all, a special conference that we're going to be putting on regarding monuments. In recent years, monuments, including several here in Delaware, have sparked an intense debate and become catalysts for acts of vandalism, pitting social protests over injustice against the preservation of heritage. So I invite you to join the University of Delaware's Center for Historic Architecture and Design and Preservation Delaware Incorporated in an engaging roundtable discussion about the past, present, and future of historical monuments in Delaware. This will take place on Wednesday, September 30th from 6:30 to 8 p.m. The roundtable will be held virtually via Zoom and is free and open to the public, but pre-registration is required. Check that out on our website and social media. Again, September 30th, 6:30 on what we're calling the Monument Wars here in Delaware. I also want to mention our annual conference and meeting. Mark your calendars for PDI's 2020 annual conference and meeting that will be held virtually over a 3-day period. We're experimenting with this format to allow more people within their agendas to find time to join us between October 15th and 17th. Through a mix of local and regional recognized speakers, panel discussions, and networking, our multi-day conference will explore current issues and topics facing historic preservation professionals, practitioners, and owners of buildings, including the relationship between preservation, sustainability, economic development, the impact of climate change and sea level rise, making historical research and literature more accessible to the general public, and promoting diversity and inclusivity in preservation. The conference is free and open to the public, but again, we ask you to register. I also want to mention the work of our African American task force. We're moving forward now with an agreement with the state's Historic Preservation Office to conduct a 12-month investigation through oral histories of the DuPont and colored schools here in Delaware, a part of our forgotten history that we think it's important to fill in. We're partnering with CHAD, the Center for Historic Architecture and Design, on this project, as they're documenting and putting into a GIS system every one of these special schools or their former location here in Delaware. And PDI, under the leadership of Dr. Abdullah Muhammad, will be doing oral histories in a selection of these in each county. I also want to touch on next year's program in 2021. With the leadership of John Matejko, a prominent architect here in Delaware, we're going to continue to explore the impacts of climate change as it intersects with historic preservation and archaeology in a series of, I think, what promise to be outstanding conferences online again in 2021. So be aware of and look out for those. Now, today we're in partnership with AIA Delaware. I'm excited about this. This is a collaboration that we just started. And we're offering AIA Delaware continuing education credits. So I'd like to introduce Nancy Payne, Executive Director of AIA Delaware, who will let us know more about these credits and how to earn them.
Thank you, Michael. Hello and welcome. I'm Nancy Payne, Executive Director of AIA Delaware, and we are very pleased to partner with Preservation Delaware for the first time ever in providing continuing education credits. To that end, I'm obligated to read a provider statement, so you'll bear with me while I do that. It'll only take a moment. AIA Delaware is a registered provider of AIA approved continuing education under provider number A127. This program today is registered with AIA for 1 hour, 1 HSW, Health, Safety, and Welfare Continuing Education Learning Unit. All providers must comply with AIA standards for continuing education programs. As such, this program does not contain content that may be deemed or construed to be an approval or an endorsement by AIA of any material of construction or method or manner of handling, using, distributing, or dealing with any material or product. Learners must attend the entire program to receive the continuing education credit, which will be reported to AIA for members. Certificates of completion are also available for anyone who wants one, member or not. If you have any questions or concerns, you can send them to me, AIA Delaware, or to AIA National. Let's see, finally, just as a point of housekeeping, if AIA members attending would like credit, just please let me know in the chat box. If anyone is looking for a certificate of completion for the course, please do the same. Use the chat feature here and we'll get you taken care of. With that, I thank you and I'll return it back to you, Mike.
Thanks, Nancy. We're excited about this partnership today. And I believe we can probably do this again in the future as we unfold the conferences for next year.
We look forward to that.
Now it's my pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker for today. Our presenter is Dominique Hawkins. In 1995, Dominique established Preservation Design Partnership as a planning and design practice focusing exclusively on offering high-quality professional services for clients with nationally significant historic sites and buildings. Dominique has developed design guidelines for historic communities and districts throughout the country, including the New Orleans, Newton, Massachusetts, Oak Park, Illinois, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Dominique has served as the preservation consultant for Morris County, New Jersey's Historic Preservation Trust Fund since 2003. She's the chair of the Architectural Committee of the Philadelphia Historical Commission and a member of the Full Historical Commission and Financial Hardship Committee from 2010 through 2016. The vice chair of Philadelphia's Historic Preservation Task Force, and she is the co-chair of its Regulatory Review Committee. In 2018, Dominique completed the Flood Mitigation Guide, Maryland's Historic Buildings, and the Fells Point Flood Mitigation Guidelines for Baltimore's Inner Harbor. In 2019, she completed the Flood Mitigation Guide for Historic Properties and the Elevation Design Guidelines for Historic Properties on behalf of the New Jersey Historic Preservation Office. She is currently working on the preservation and conservation of the Alamo and the comprehensive rehabilitation of the New Jersey Executive State House. Dominique, thanks so much for being with us today, and it's all yours.
So Dominique, I just made you a host, so you should have controls at this point.
Great. You make me sound like a very busy lady, so thank you for that. So first, I really appreciate sort of part two, or the opportunity to do part two. This was originally envisioned as an all-day seminar, so we're trying to squeeze a lot of information into two 45-minute sessions, so please bear with me. I want to just start by talking about how I got into flood mitigation. Oh, pardon me, I have to do my AIA learning objectives. We didn't have this last time. So we have 4 learning objectives, and here they are. You can all read them. So hopefully I will answer all of these by the end so everyone can get their AIA credits. So the reason I got into flood mitigation is that in running around the country doing design guidelines and looking at historic places, many of them were adjacent to water. And more communities were struggling with how to address flooding and historic buildings. I started working in New Orleans immediately or within about 2 years after Katrina, and looking at how Katrina was still very much in, or excuse me, New Orleans was still very much in recovery, and how they were trying to balance flood mitigation with trying to maintain their historic communities was a real challenge. And you were getting these buildings elevated, 6 feet above their neighbors in terms of applying the FEMA rules. So I set about to learn what the FEMA rules are that are driving this whole conversation. So first, I'm going to step back a minute, and I just want to talk about different kinds of flooding. And I apologize for those of you who had part 1 of this, but I think it's important to understand sort of the variables that you're dealing with. So one type of flooding is called nuisance flooding or persistent flooding. It's high tide flooding at the beach. It's when you go and when the tide is high, either the bay or along certain blocks on the beach or in beach neighborhoods, that the water is going to be high enough that if you drive your car through, you're going to be splashing through puddles. You may not be able to walk down the sidewalk. So nuisance flooding is this persistent, like, oh yeah, moon is full, it's flooding. Coastal flooding, generally, as it implies, comes in from the coast, and it's usually a big storm. So it's a hurricane, it's a tropical storm, it's a nor'easter. And one of the unique features of coastal flooding is it's often accompanied by high winds and waves. And those are 2 really important things to think about, because wind can topple a building that is not on a sound foundation, and waves can knock the building off of the foundation. Ice also poses a risk. Ice flooding, what occurs in ice flooding is basically you get ice that mounds up against an object, such as the bridge on the horizon. And what ends up occurring is that it dams up behind it, so the water level in the river will rise. You can also have riverine flooding. I mean, one publication I just finished actually in July was Flood Mitigation, a guide for Manayunk in Philadelphia. So Manayunk is to your left. This is the Schuylkill River. So look at how low this river is relative to those buildings.
So Dominique, if I could just interject here, I'm not seeing the slides. If you can share your screen.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Then I will start because my pictures are so good. So I apologize. I'm Zoom challenged today. There you go. Share screen. Okay. I'm so sorry.
There you go.
There I go. So there's our learning objectives. Yay. Okay. So historic communities are always flooding. This is nuisance flooding. This is the roadway causes you to go around. Do this quickly. This is what wind and waves look like. This is the aftermath of wind, waves, and water. Ice on a river, and we were here. Okay. So this is the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia. I just did a flood guide from Manayunk in Philadelphia. This is what it looked like on the other side of the buildings. So the water rose from the river and was percolating up on the street. A lot of, you can also get flooding off of lakes. A lot of flooding is due to either storms coming in and the impact of that storm, wind, water, wave combination, rain coming down. It could also, in the case of a river, be raining upstream and come down and then affect a neighborhood below. So all of those things can cause flood. The other thing that I'm really not going to spend a lot of time talking about is you can also have infrastructure failure. So water main break, for example, in a neighborhood could also cause a flood. So the National Flood Insurance Program was founded in 1968. So most people are unaware that their homeowner's policy does not cover flooding. So no standard homeowner's policy covers flooding. So what that means is that if you do not have flood insurance, the full risk of the flood is on you. So any repairs that you want to do or any losses that you have are on you to repair. So financially. The federal government does not magically come in and throw money at a flood. So the National Flood Insurance Program was founded in '68 because a lot of property owners had no flood insurance. And they were realizing that flooding was becoming an increasing problem. So flood insurance is available to any community that meets the floodplain management regulations of the National Flood Insurance Program. I have not checked for Delaware whether all the communities in Delaware meet that requirement, but most communities typically do. You can get flood insurance. Standard policies are $250,000 for the property, which includes the building, and $100,000 for the contents. Just like all insurance, the rate is tied to the risk. If you are in a very vulnerable place, if you are on the ocean and you have flooded, 10 times before, your rates are going to be higher than somebody who has never flooded. And one of the other things to keep in mind is that for any property that has an FDIC approved mortgage, which is a federally backed mortgage, the federal government has a strong interest in not paying out insurance. They're going to require you have flood insurance. So they're protecting their investment. FDIC wants to protect their investment. They're going to make you have flood insurance as long as your mortgage is being held. So there are a couple of caveats. There's something called a pre-firm building. Pre-firm buildings are basically every historic building. So firm, it refers to a flood insurance rate map. And these are, and I apologize, I have to get the terms in because they're going to become part of your lingo. Firm is a flood insurance rate map. A pre-firm building is a building that was constructed before the flood insurance rate map was enacted in your community. So be it a city, a town, a township. So it's usually around the 1960s, early 70s that most flood insurance rate maps were initially enacted. So if that's the case, all of the historic buildings are pre-firm. So if you think about historic buildings, they're built before the 60s in most communities. So the concept or the National Flood Insurance Program, in order to minimize the amount of payouts, that's their goal, is incentivizing communities to improve their flood resilience. And so they incentivize communities who in turn incentivize property owners. And they do this through their floodplain managers and their building codes and their zoning codes. So one of the other things the National Flood Insurance Program does is it develops these flood insurance rate maps. So these things look really cryptic. It took me a long time to figure them out, but I'll give you the quick brief as to what you got to look for. So this is a flood insurance rate map for Lewis, Delaware. So everywhere that's shown in blue has a chance of flooding. It's the entire town. And this area that's shown in blue is known as what's called the Special Flood Hazard Area. And what that means is that in any given year, it has a 1% chance of flooding. So if you look at the red circles, the top red circle, or oval, I guess it is located near the beach. And then there's the one further inland. So the top one says Zone VE. What is Zone V indicates is that it's velocity. Velocity is waves. So there is special consideration if you are located in a flooding area where there are waves. The lower one says Zone AE. A is no waves. So it's just rising water. So think about a bathtub rising versus sitting on a beach. So the top one also says, and I'm sort of looking with my glasses here, I think it says 8 feet. And what the 8 feet denotes is that it is 8 feet below the base flood elevation. So base flood elevation is the height at which during the 1% flood, your house will not flood. So the ground near the top beach location is 8 feet below where it will not flood, where the chance of flooding is 1% or less. Does that make sense? So the bottom one says 7 feet. So that one is 7 feet below where the chance of flooding is 1% or less. So the concept is that there's the ground elevation and then there's a house elevation. Those two things are different. So most homes are elevated a couple feet off the ground. So don't assume that it's meaning that you have to raise your house 8 feet off the ground to be safe. So a couple of other terms. There's a term called freeboard. So most communities, as I said, the National Flood Insurance Program is very interested in minimizing the amount of payouts and level of risk to property owners. So they encourage, there are mechanisms in the National Flood Insurance Program that encourage being more stringent than meeting what is called this base flood elevation. And that designation is freeboard. So freeboard is an additional generally 1 to 2 feet on top of this base flood elevation. And that is referred to as the design flood elevation. So if you're building a house today, instead of building it at this base flood elevation, the municipality may say you have to build it 1 to 2 feet above the base flood elevation to meet the design flood elevation. And I said specifically the municipality. And the reason I said that the municipality is every municipality administers their own floodplain management system. There's no person from the state or the federal government is going to tell you how to build. It's managed by the local municipality. They may be informed by the state, who is then informed by the federal government. But the federal government does not tell you how high to build your house. So one of the things that is also apparent is, or one of the things I should state, is that all of those maps are based upon historical data associated with flooding. So it looks back over the previous years and says, okay, in this location, it has flooded, at these times. So, and if we look back at the past and it has flooded, 10 times in this location in the last 100 years, and the flood levels are this high, then that's how they are calculating the flood risk. It is not taking into account either sea level rise or subsidence. It's based upon historical data. So this New York Times article was from June of this year. The official FEMA map of level of flood risk is on the right, or excuse me, is on the left, and independent researchers' estimate is on the right. So there's a great disparity between what FEMA is showing on their maps and what scientists are saying is real. I would also like to note the flooding is not all at the coast. There's a lot of flooding in the middle. So rivers are a huge source of flooding. And we coast people tend to think about the coast, but the center of the country is also vulnerable to flooding. So one of the drivers for people to change, to mitigate their property, mitigate is the act of changing to improve a situation, to mitigate for flood is really flood insurance. Because again, the level of the rate is tied to the level of vulnerability. So if I can improve my property and reduce my vulnerability, my flood insurance will be reduced. The flood insurance company will not come in and tell you, you have to do X, Y, or Z. And that's important to know if you sit on a historical commission and you get somebody walking in and said, but they told me I have to. No, they didn't. This will benefit you in terms of your rate, and that's great. But it's not dictated by a flood insurance company. So the National Flood Insurance Program is supposed to be self-sufficient, meaning the amount of money they take in is supposed to equal or exceed the amount of money they give away. Let's think about the past. We had Katrinas, we had Harveys, we had Irmas, we had Michaels, we had what, name a storm. We have Sally. Today we have Sally. The problem is the flood insurance program has been giving away money like you won't believe, and the federal government is sick of it. So they are looking at, or they have been increasing the rates of flood insurance Since 2012, they've been incrementally increasing the rate. So the rate of the money that they take in equals the rate that they give away. The problem is they can't seem to make up the difference. So flood insurance rate will progressively go higher and higher. So there are two factors, and this is political to some people, but climate change is a thing. And that's my opinion, and I'll just state it. So there are two things that are going with it. One is sea level rise. The height of the water is rising. The other is subsidence. The height of the ground is dropping. Subsidence occurs largely, depends on where you are, but largely it's because we are pulling things out of the ground. So as we pull out water or oil or natural gas, you're sort of dropping the level of the grade. I've also heard, and I'm not a geologist, that the tectonic plates also impact this. So whatever it might be, the level of the earth relative to the sea is changing. So here's the real world impact on a historic district. This is St. Michael's in Maryland. I did some work in Maryland. All the red squares are parts of or historically designated sites. So there's the historic district. So if you look at the map on the right, if you have inundation from 2 to 5 feet, it's sort of the, I don't know if yeah, here we go. So it sort of starts to get into here, right? So they're estimating that in Maryland, they were estimating that the height of the Chesapeake was going to go up 2.1 feet by 2050 and over 4 feet by 2100. And that does not include for a storm surge. And storm surge, we're hearing a lot on the news these days, it's when the waves come in. So the wave action is a lot higher. And yes, you do get waves like that on the Chesapeake. So this is from sealevelrise.org. In the last 35 years, Delaware had, or excuse me, from 1981 to 2016, since 6 inches of sea level rise. From 17 to 35, excuse me, they're anticipating another 6 inches. So the speed of this is increasing. You can get a lot of information online about understanding the flood risk that a community is facing. One of the things I will really strongly emphasize is you should know whether or not it's based upon historical data, such as the firms, or whether or not it projects for sea level rise. So how do you assess historic or flood risk in a neighborhood? All the same houses in a row. The ones at the bottom of the hill are at greater risk for flooding. I mean, that's it. So there may not be a magic answer, which is what many people look for in terms of how you regulate in a historic context, changing buildings. Elevation is one of the key ways to address flooding for residential buildings. And there are differentiations between residential and commercial, and I'm going to really stick this with residential for today. So elevation is the most common way to address flood mitigation. So the little wavy line there is the base flood elevation, the design flood elevation. The person at the top of the hill has no flood risk, probably in their basement, but we'll just leave that out of the equation. And the person at the bottom of the hill has the first floor pretty much underwater. So what do? If you're going to raise the house, you get a very different kind of image about what that looks like and what does that mean in a historic context. A can leave their house as is. We're assuming, again, the basement doesn't exist. B probably took an approach that none of us would be happy with, but is a real typical approach of I get to have this bonus space downstairs and I can put my, get a garage and get some parking and maybe some storage and get some stuff. C, I would say, also took an acceptable approach. By the time we get to D, is the house so out of proportion that is it really historic anymore? Or would we consider that to be part of the context anymore? So what are the options for residential property owners? So some of them are fairly straightforward. Again, if we're dealing with nuisance flooding, we may not have to do that much. As we get into the more severe situations, we have to do more. So some of the basic things to start with are landscape improvements. Then there are what I call basic improvements, building elevation and wet flood proofing. I included a couple things that are not National Flood Insurance Program compliant, just to show you what they are. That's dry flood proofing and what's called perimeter barriers. There's also relocation and acquisition and demolition. And I'm sure people who are true preservationists are kind of grumbly about, is demolition really an option? And the answer is yes. And I took a while to be convinced, but we'll get there. So what are landscape improvements? Well, they're generally geared towards managing water and containing it on site. So instead of allowing water to run off the road and go into a storm sewer, let's manage it on site. So it goes back to many architects on the program will know LEED. The idea of stormwater management, keep it on site, absorb it back into the aquifer. Also use things like natural plants, excuse me, native plants, because they need less water and less chemicals. And these can take lots of forms. So here's a different kind of a rain garden adjacent to a building, and it's actually even capturing the water that's coming down that downspout. Another way to capture water is in rain barrels. And they don't have to be ugly, and they can go away. But the idea of this is that you're taking the water off your roof and then you're using that to water your garden. You can also use paving that allows water to be absorbed. So it again is not running off and causing further problems downstream or to an adjacent property. And here are other paving options that do a similar kind of absorption. So one of the best ways to absorb waters is to actually have a lot of native plants and not grass. Grass does not have deep enough root systems to actually absorb it and put it back into the soil. So again, native plants use less chemicals, but they also, and larger plants and trees have the ability to drive water down into the aquifers, or further down into the soil at least. We need to maintain buildings. A poorly maintained building is extraordinarily vulnerable to flooding. The porch is going to rip off, the shutters will come off in the windstorm, and all of the little cracks and crevices around the foundation will be avenues for moisture to come in. So maintaining buildings is critical. It's also, if you're really going to do a mitigation project, such as elevating a building, you cannot elevate a poorly maintained building. Structurally, it will not hold up during that process. Other basic things, get all the stuff out of the basement. All the stuff that costs money to replace. So anything with an electrical switch or a gas switch has to come out of the basement. That means taking all heaters, washers and dryers, all appliances, electrical boxes, alarm systems, all of that stuff out of vulnerable locations. So what that will mean is moving furnaces upstairs. So you're going to start giving up basement space or residential space, so to speak, to house equipment that is vulnerable to flooding. The cost of replacing this, after the fact will be huge. So if you have an option, move it upstairs. If you're installing air conditioners, put them on platforms. And there are lots of different ways to do this in in row houses, they also mount them to the wall, but get them off of the ground. Move all the plumbing and the electrical up. So I happened to go into this building, which had recently been flooded, and this was an act in progress. So they were moving all of the electrical, they had torn off the bottom of the baseboard, and they were moving all the electrical up, from the standard height above grade in the baseboard to higher, because that's where the flood vulnerability was. And for the architects, this also means everything, all the junction boxes, all the connectors, all the switches, everything has to be high enough that it doesn't get flooded. Something that again makes preservationists squeamish, solar panels. after a storm, energy independence will help you recover a lot faster. And we have to think about whether or not it makes sense to say, yes, solar panels don't, meet our aesthetic criteria for our historic district, but solar panels will allow you to run a generator, or excuse me, will allow you to run fans and equipment to repair your house immediately after a flood, whereas the larger community might actually still be without power. And on the right, in the background, tucked back there, is a generator. So if you can, you also have to figure out how to make generators work. And then there's elevation. This is an unfortunate example of an elevation where I will say it's not in keeping with the historic character of this house. But, and I would also argue that you can't have all those windows and doors downstairs, but it's such an amazing, I'll say, contradiction that I thought it would be interesting to share. So what is elevation? Elevation, you can elevate any kind of building. It just gets more expensive when they are bigger and when they are heavier. So the harder buildings to elevate are going to be your stone and your brick buildings. It's hard to elevate a slab-on-grade construction. It can be done. One of the most challenging things to deal with is row houses, and I didn't include that in this, but that's also another kind of elevation. There's non-structural elevation. I have one example of that. So when you elevate a building, most people elevate frame buildings, but when you elevate a building, you have to get it off of its structure. So you can see all the beams going through to pick it up, lift it up on cribbing, or I'm sorry, you have to disconnect all the connections, so all the piping, etc. Get it up on cribbing. So once you get it up in the air, you have spent most of the money. So if I could elevate this another, 6 or so feet and get a garage, wouldn't that be great? And that's the logic that a lot of people will take. So what we have to do is to start to think about as preservationists, how can we balance that? Or what can we do to mitigate the mitigation so it doesn't become this sort of albatross in the neighborhood. So this is an example of, if I could elevate it, why not elevate it more? So that house is probably a lot safer that it's that high, and I'm sure that garage space will be greatly appreciated, but does it still maintain the historic integrity that you were hoping it would maintain? So here are the options for how you elevate a building. One is you can put it up on fill and have the lowest floor above what is that design flood elevation. And these are all for zone A. So this is all the bathtub situation where the water's just rising. So this doesn't necessarily work for waves. You can also create a perimeter wall, elevate it onto that perimeter wall or foundation, raised foundation, and then have flood openings. So have water be able to go in and out. And what that does is it mitigates the lateral forces going through, so you don't cave in your walls. So the flood openings, and I don't know if you can see my cursor, it's not showing up here. Here you go. The flood openings allow the water to go through. You can also, if the building originally had a basement and you have already taken out all that equipment and heating systems and air conditioners and all the rest of it and moved it up, you can also fill in your basement, leave it there, and then put it up on a raised foundation. You can also do piers and piles. So it doesn't have to look terrible. So here's a lovely example. So this is a slab-on-grade that's been raised up. So that first floor is about the height of the terrace. And because of the sort of stepped way that they did it, it's actually lovely. And it fits in with the surroundings. Again, another example, a smaller scale, but that's a slab-on-grade house that is, perfectly contextual. So some of the things that they did was that small retaining wall and the steps, and they have the steps getting narrower as you go up. And I think that this is the composition really works, and I think is sympathetic to the way it historically looked. This is an example where you have it on a raised foundation. So the foundation along here has been constructed of concrete block. Concrete block and poured concrete are the acceptable materials to meet National Flood Insurance Protection Standards for raised elevations. You can dress up the pig because concrete blocks and concrete aren't necessarily beautiful, but you need to be able to have the structural reinforcing to make it work. So the holes along the edge, you can see the holes, are for flood vents. And not the top holes. That was where they lifted the house onto it, but sort of these little sort of right below it. And I'm sorry, that image is not very good. But around the perimeter of that foundation, they have flood vents, which lets the water go in and out. So this house does not have a basement. That's what flood vents look like, the lower ones. So the water goes in and out, and the water levels at the interior and exterior stay the same. So we're saying that the flood water can come into the basement or the crawl space, can get wet, and then it will go away. You can also have an open foundation. So lattice is one of those materials that can get blown out easily during a flood event. And I'm sorry, I'm looking at the time and I have to speed it up. I apologize. And this is what it looks like with piers or piles, which this is not a historic building, but grandma's not coming to dinner. So in considering options, one of the things to think about is the size of your parcel. The larger the parcel, the better, easier it is to deal, or the easier it is to deal with things like stairs and access. So if you look at the stairs, these are all, so all of them, and there's a consistency, have a elevation heights of 2'4", 4'8", and then 7'0". But the stairs start to get really tight as you start to have to go higher and higher. And the stairs can become a whole thing of their own. But you can also, make them lovely. So in this instance, they actually maintain that center arrival point to the house, which is the appropriate historical way to get in, meaning they were able to maintain that orientation, and the lattice again breaks away. In this instance, they had to move it to the side to achieve that height. You also have to think about ADA access. So in a lot of buildings, this one happens to be used for a business, but it could also just be somebody's home and they need to get that access. And in thinking about elevating buildings, you can see the flood vents down at the side here. But in thinking about elevating buildings, also think about screening and how you're transitioning from that raised elevation down back to grade. So in looking down the street house, the yellow house was elevated. And in my mind, it's a successful elevation. But here are the compromises. Same yellow house. That used to be a forward-facing stair, but because it went higher, they didn't have enough room to continue it to be forward-facing before they ended up in the street. So that foundation, which is sort of terracotta colored, is actually colored concrete, mimicking brick. In my mind, that's fairly successful. So we did some case studies for New Jersey to show what is it like to elevate buildings. So on the right is what the original building would have looked like. On the left, it's been elevated 2.4 feet, 4.8 feet, 7 feet. So you can mitigate what that change in height is, but you do have to make compromises. The orientation of the stair has changed. We added that perimeter wall to give it sort of a base. It's pretty tight to the street. So looking at, how can we make it still look like it fits in this neighborhood, even though it is now hovering in many ways above its neighbor. It's kind of easier at a 2-story house or 2.5-story house. So that's 2.5 or 2'4", 4'8". And then when we get to 7.0, again, that stair in the front got too long. We had to flip it around. You know, it gets less and less successful, I will say, the higher you go. And one of the other things to keep in mind is that in historic districts, if you build new construction, and so we have a lovely little historic, you know, home to the right, new construction has to be compliant with all floodplain regulations in the municipality. So the two buildings, the tan buildings on the left, I won't use anything pejorative but a color, but the two tan buildings on the left are floodplain compliant. And they got what they wanted, which was the garages on the first floor, entrance on the first floor, all their living spaces above that base flood elevation. So this is what wet proofing looks like. And wet flood proofing is abandoning the lower levels of the building to parking, storage, and access. Those are the three things you could do. So those two buildings are wet flood proof, as is that. Parking, access, storage, no living spaces, no utilities. This is in Philadelphia. I stopped my car to take that photo because that's a wet flood proofed row house community. This is also wet flood proofed, and this example I love. So the house on the right is an old home. They've abandoned the basement and the first floor. Okay, and if you look at the detailed photo on the left, on the top, the basement windows are blacked out from behind. The first floor does have access, but if you go on the back of the building, the first floor is garage. It's a garage and storage. All their living space is upstairs. It happened to be a house where the building was in dire need of repair, and it was structurally compromised. So this was something that was an acceptable alternative. This is in Baltimore. Things that you can do to protect your house that are not compliant with the National Flood Insurance Program. You can keep the water out. It's called dry flood proofing. So it's the sandbags, and it is in this case the closing up of windows. You do not get flood insurance credit for this, and I want to be really clear about it. But keeping the water out is a big advantage. Barriers and shields are another one, which is taking shields and putting them in channels. And this happens to be a restaurant, so it's a more heavy duty use. But the shields on the left go into the channels on the window and door, and they keep the water out of the building. This only works in masonry buildings. If you have a wood frame building, there are too many cracks and crevices, the water is going to go in. You can also move a building. Moving a building is something that the National Park Service, has standards on relocation. Here we go. So it's the same as lifting a building, except you also have to find a new site, and that site, to the greatest extent possible, should be similar in the historic context to the original site. Moving a large building poses other challenges in terms of physically how do you get it from point A to point B, and it's not about lifting it, it's thinking about every telephone wire and electrical line and bridge and overpass, etc., and can you physically get it to a new site. Acquisition and demolition. At some point you gotta say goodbye. And the reality is that if you remove certain buildings, you could, in certain instances, improve the flood or the resilience of adjacent buildings because you are providing the water somewhere to go. So I don't know if you are aware, a couple of years ago, Ellicott City in Maryland in 2016 had a 1,000-year flood. So you've heard 100-year flood, 500-year flood. They had a 1,000-year flood in 2016. And they had another 1,000-year flood in 2018. So that was two 1,000-year floods in 2 years. The second one killed somebody. They decided to demolish several buildings in their historic district. I think they landed at 10 to provide the water somewhere to go, to save the historic district as a whole. So demolition is a mitigation option, in my opinion, and FEMA's actually. And then at some point you may have to say goodbye. And the reality is we can't necessarily live in places where it floods a lot forever. But there is, you know, and we have to think about what and how we live. So if I lived next door to this person, my house was on 10-foot stilts and I was able to, you know, live through the storm, but all my neighbors around me are no longer there. Is that really where I want to be? So, and the reality is probably not. So no one wants to be the last house standing. And no matter what the condition may be. And I think I am very close to the end of my time, so I'm wrapping up. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Dominique, that was great. Thank you. Fabulous as always. I'll ask that if you've got questions, if you can add them to the chat feature, it might be easiest for us to address them. If it's necessary to have a conversation dialogue about it, I'll unmute you. There's not a tremendous amount of people here today, so I can unmute you and we can have a conversation about it. But if you've got questions, feel free to add them to the chat feature to start with, and we'll go from there. Well, I'll start. Dominique, just I know this is a kind of a hot potato, but obviously saying goodbye and demolition, there's going to be a tremendous community pushback on that topic. Can you share your experiences on trying to convince folks that that's actually an option?
I'm happy to say I've never had to. It's not an easy thing to talk about. So I'm not going to specifically answer your question, but I'll give you my experiences. How's that? Okay. So as I mentioned, I spent a lot of time in New Orleans post Katrina, and one of the places that I spent my time is the Lower Ninth. The Lower Ninth is actually a historic district. Large portions of the Lower Ninth are historic districts. So there was a lot of conversation at that time about should the footprint of Katrina's citizens extend as far as it does, because fewer people were moving back post-Katrina, and does it make sense to shrink the city? In doing so, you sort of, you shed neighborhoods or sections of town. And the sense of place that people had to their place was so strong, and it was about the fact that their community was their everything, and that if you had families living on a block where, you know, mom, grandma, my sister down the street would watch the kids as they raced up and down, and everyone sat on their front porch and everyone knew each other and they all talked to each other, and that was their world. I think that's a really, really hard conversation to have. Having said that, in Maryland, I observed islands where people had abandoned the islands because the Chesapeake is rising so fast. And once the water rises to a certain point that you can no longer get over the causeway to get to work, the store leaves, the church closes, as you start to lose that sense of community, then more and more people leave, and it happens faster and faster. So saying goodbye, and saying goodbye could also be traumatic, right? If the big storm comes through and it wipes out a section of town or wipes out the water facility that services a section of town, and the community decides they're not going to rebuild, then it's gone.
Got it. So let me address a few folks that also put questions in. Dr. Muhammad, who's with us today, what is the effectiveness of placing a flood wall gate around a group of historic properties?
So here's the caveat about flood walls or barriers. You can install them, and there are different kinds. There are the permanent kind where you can literally build a wall and then you put similar kinds of shields as the barriers and shields in the openings. So you can do that. You can also get temporary ones where they're inflatable, and inflatable with water. So it's basically a giant balloon you fill with water and you surround a building. You can also, that's what sandbags are, essentially. You can do that as well. So that can be done. It comes at a cost, obviously, but it's also something that you have to have somebody available to do it immediately before the flood. So if you know the storm is coming, then that could work, as long as somebody can manage that process. But if you're in a situation where you have flash floods, like river flooding, and you have a limited amount of time, it won't necessarily work. But none of those are compliant for the National Flood Insurance Program to reduce your flood insurance is the sort of underlying. So, and what I'm trying to do is give information, but also be really clear. National Flood Insurance Program for residential buildings allows elevations and wet flood proofings. That's it. Okay.
So two last questions, and I don't want to run off or run over too much, but if a house is raised or moved, is it structurally sound as it was in its original state?
It's probably better because the act of to get a house ready to lift off its ground, you have to really make sure it is tight and braced and sort of held together well. And I will bet that that's the most attention that house will have had in its last 100 years. So it's probably better.
And lastly, if a historic home is moved, does it lose its status as contributing?
Depends. And I hate giving that answer, but depends is the answer. So if you have a beachfront house that overlooks the water, that has a certain context to the water, and you move it 5 blocks inland, and that context to the water is lost, then the context is gone. So it probably loses its historic status. If, however, the physicality of that house, meaning what it looks like, so if it is similar to all the other houses on the block where you move it, then maybe not. So I would say it depends. One of the things that I failed to mention, and I'm sorry, is the National Park Service actually came up with flood mitigation guidance in November of 2019. So there is a document, and you can Google it, the National Park Service's guidance. The big caveat is it comes with no pictures. It's just words. So they are working on a graphic version, and I understand it's supposed to be released this fall. So, you know, they'll have ways of describing this that will help local municipalities sort of work through these issues.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dominique. Is there any last